Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and tonight we are in like Flynn with one of the greatest, most influential adventure films ever made. From 1938, it is The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring the fabulous Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, with an amazing supporting cast headed by Basil Rathbone and Claude Rains. Joining us tonight is a prolific author and film historian. He's written the book Warner Brothers 100. Please welcome Mr. Mark A. Vieira. How are you doing tonight, Mark?
I'm happy to be here.
This is certainly one of the most influential action adventure films ever made, and if I'm not mistaken, it is the first feature length Robin Hood film to be shot fully in sound and color.
That's correct, yes. The previous Robin Hood classic, blockbuster, $5 million grossing silent film, was with Douglas Fairbanks in 1922, and it opened the Egyptian Theater.
So I'm sure, this is such a ubiquitous folk tale throughout the centuries. Why did it take so long for Warner Brothers to get around to remaking it?
It was Hal Wallace was the executive producer, working under Jack Warner, and he wisely felt that they just needed the right combination of writers, especially, and cast to do it, and to really tell the story properly. And they could have used James Cagney in the early 30s, but they would not have had three-strip Technicolor, which was really inaugurated in 1935 with Becky Sharp, and that color was such an important aspect of this film when it was released, because Technicolor came in, as I say, in 1935, three-strip feature film. But it wasn't until this year, this of 38, and this film, The Adventures of Robin Hood, that they had a new palette where the colors were more vibrant and more saturated, and because they'd been kind of pastel and muted the first couple of years of the three strip, and before that the two color Technicolor process, which was from the early 20s until 1934, that only had red and green, didn't have three colors, and it was effective for certain kinds of stories or musical numbers or horror films, but for something like this, where the reds and the blues just blast out of the screen, it was wonderful that they were able to wait and do it right.
It's certainly a gorgeous looking film. You look at the palette, you look at the composition of this film. It's certainly as gorgeous as anything you'd see in The Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind the following year.
Warner Brothers really had top-notch art direction. Carl Jules Weil, for example, that who worked on this, was just a master. And of course, working in black and white, with he and Anton Groth had done fantastic things. But when they were given the advantage of color, they really went to town. And now you have to be aware that there was a Technicolor consultant, somebody who came from that corporation, came across town and sat with them at every stage of the planning and the shooting, and said, "Oh no, you can't use a pure white. That's going to blow out on the screen. It'll cause halos around it and cause problems. And you got to use a certain type of red if you want to, convey those banners flying. It's got to be a certain kind of red." So they prescribe what kind of dyes to use and everything. But this film has become such a legendary production because it really scored in so many different areas. It was budgeted at $1.5 million, ended up costing $2 million, which was a tremendous amount of money in the late 1930s, when the country was still not quite out of the Great Depression. Um, and it really solidified Errol Flynn's stardom in a super way. He became a superstar with this film. Olivia de Havilland became a super leading lady, and Basil Rathbone, this was his greatest supporting role. He became the highest paid supporting actor because of this film. He was earning $5,000 a week, which was a tremendous amount of money for a supporting actor in those days. It was usually, they were lucky to get 1,000. And also, the film was begun by William Keighley, who was a very good director for Warner Brothers, a British director of American films. And the film fell 9 days behind schedule within the first month on location in Chico, California, shooting in Bidwell Park. And when they got back to Warner Brothers to shoot some exteriors around there, but mostly interiors on these gigantic, what do you call it, castle sets, beautiful castle sets. Jack Warner said to Hal Wallace, "He's taking too long. This is going to end up costing way too much, and there are only so many seats, theater seats in the world. You can't play a movie longer than a certain amount of time. We'll never get the money back on this if we get much more behind schedule with this Keighley directing. Let's get Michael Curtiz in, who did Captain Blood, which made Errol Flynn a star 3 years earlier, and The Charge of the Light Brigade, which again really made a big hit. So Curtiz was a great director. He would later do, as you know, Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and so they brought him in to do Robin Hood. He didn't reshoot anything; there wasn't time, but he did really speed up the production and the scenes in the castle, especially the sword fights. He did a fantastic job. Whereas some studios would have had a montage director doing those things or a second unit, Michael Curtiz insisted on doing them because he knew what angles he wanted. He knew how he wanted the sword fights to play. They were choreographed like musical numbers. And by the way, they started rehearsing in August, mid-August, a month before any camera turned, because there was such emphasis on physical grace, the agility, the precision. They had these great fencing instructors, and they worked with all the actors. But Basil Rathbone really was a superior swordsman. I mean, he had that gift, and Errol Flynn could do it. He did have the agility, and he was a natural athlete. But he wasn't as good as Basil Rathbone. So they did use a couple times. They did have him doubled for certain shots. Rathbone not as much though. But Errol Flynn at this point was he was a really in true life adventurer. I mean, because this is the adventures of Robin Hood. Well, Robin Hood, that character had nothing much on Errol Flynn, who from his teenage years had been going all through the South Pacific, just doing one adventure, one scam after another, one crooked thing, and really learned about life and learned about survival and learned about people. And by the time he made Robin Hood, he'd written a novel, he'd written a screenplay. He was married to a tempestuous French actress named Lily Damita, and they did not have a happy marriage, but they certainly made a gorgeous couple. If you ever saw pictures of them, but the point is, what he brought to this film was the personality of a real life adventurer. It wasn't, his father was a botanist, a scientist. Now, if you had his father playing Robin Hood, it wouldn't have had the same impact because he was a teacher, a scientist. But so you have a real life adventurer playing an adventure, playing a hero, and it's wonderfully effective. But also, he did acquire dramatic skills in Britain for a number of years with stock companies and in the West End, and he could handle any kind of dialogue, and that's important for these kind of films because dialogue of a historical film is not the same as the film taking place in Brooklyn in 1938. So he managed to really do that as well as Basil Rathbone did, who was a Shakespearean veteran, not to mention Claude Rains. They were brilliant actors, and Errol Flynn held his own with them. But the problem with Errol Flynn was being an adventurer, having a restless spirit, and having a self-esteem that was not rock solid,
Hmm.
primarily because his mother had been cruel to him in his childhood and had really given him a complex. So he felt he constantly had to prove himself with women and in athletics and in fights in public places. Uh, just before they filmed this, he had been in Cuba and gotten into a fist fight in a nightclub. So, you know, you have sort of a real life Robin Hood playing, because he felt that his work was to take money away from Warner Brothers and give it to the American public,
Hmm.
make them happy.
Which he certainly did. Now, Mark, for anyone in the audience who has never seen The Adventures of Robin Hood, what do they have to look forward to tonight?
Ooh. Um, okay, in the first place, it got an Academy Award for editing. It got an awards for art direction and color cinematography. It moves like a film from now. The cutting is cut, cut, cut. There's no dull. There's no expository slowness or flat moments. It really just it moves, and that was Michael Curtiz's stock in trade. He made films that moved like movies. They weren't radio shows. They weren't tableaus of images. They really moved. He just held the shot long enough to give you the information you needed before he moved on to the next shot.
Hmm.
So you'll see a film that deals with uh, a man who's of the of royal blood, but on the outs with the establishment, and he's out there stealing from them and giving to poor people whom they are oppressing. So there is a Warner Brothers social justice theme in this film,
Oh,
which was relevant in two ways. Given what happened in the Great Depression, where the country was led astray by financiers and then left on its own to starve until Roosevelt stopped the gold being exported from the country, stopping the possibility of a total economic collapse. And the other thing was that the fascist uh, powers in Europe who were oppressing people, and we didn't know exactly how bad that was at this point, but it was very bad. But
hmm.
Warner's had an idea, so the themes in this movie about the poor people, good people being oppressed and having someone come to their rescue were very very relevant to 1938 audiences.
Without further ado, from 1938, directed by Michael Curtiz, The Adventures of Robin Hood. Wow, that is such a wonderfully entertaining film.
Boy, I can still see the colors glowing on the screen. Now, in mentioning color, I want to recommend to you a book that deals in great, unprecedented detail with the life of Errol Flynn. And here it is, uh, by Robert Florshock. And I helped him with a color picture that's on the cover of the book, restoring from the original transparency the picture of Errol Flynn. And uh, it's interesting that Errol Flynn, during this film, went joyriding in airplanes in the Sacramento area during the filming. I mean, not the moment he's filming, but on his day off,
Right.
which threw the producers into a panic. I mean, accidents could easily happen. He was accident prone in the first place because he was so physical, always spraining something in some kind of like tennis or something. Um, and he also had been very ill with malaria in the South Seas in his, I guess, early 20s. And he would occasionally have it come back on him and lay him out for days at a time.
Hmm.
Um, and it didn't help that he was drinking heavily. He loved partying and smoking cigarettes, and um, he was a wild character. But everybody who knew him said that he was gifted with this extraordinary likability. You just liked him when you met him, uh, and he was so charming, and like many people who succeed in politics, show business, he made you feel that you were the only person to whom he was speaking when he was speaking to you.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't look over your shoulder and see who's coming in the room. No, it was always with you. The only failing he had was he would forget what he promised to do for you, so he let everybody down, a lot of people down. But while he was with you, he was just tremendous company, and a very witty and knowledgeable, well-read, a real Renaissance man, very, very, talented in so many ways. But he was able to project this wonderful personality on screen that he may or may not have had in real life. I mean, he was able to project a very sympathetic and empathetic, kind and loyal and noble person. That was his great ability, his great gift. And people expected that in real life, and then when he didn't show up on time or he had a hangover or whatever, they were, disappointed more than they would have been if, Basil Rathbone had done it to them, which he never would.
Right.
That's an ironic thing. Rathbone was such a rigidly self-governing and scrupulous person, with one exception. He and his wife threw immense parties. They had this money coming in, like pouring onto him because he was always working. And they'd put these parties on in their Los Feliz mansion that were just unbelievably lavish. And the money ran out eventually. And he had to work on all these horror films in the 60s for American International. And he wasn't happy about it, especially when little kids would come up to him and say, "Oh, Sherlock Holmes, sign my autograph, sign my autograph." So if you went up to him, if you were a teenager or in your 20s or 30s, and you said, "Oh, Guy of Gisborne," quoting the Robin Hood, there was a whole different thing. He would say, "Oh, well, thank you very much." But if it was Sherlock Holmes, okay, here, I'll go away. To these little kids.
What if I said Baron Frankenstein? I don't imagine that would have a great reaction either.
I don't think so either.
Yeah. Which is the irony. Like you said, he was such a high-paid supporting actor in these big A-list films. But then, as a classic horror fan, I know him as the star of movies like Son of Frankenstein, the Sherlock Holmes films, the AIP stuff. So it is kind of a shame when these people you idolize reject that image.
Especially as he had done a major Romeo and Juliet on Broadway with Katharine Cornell, the great lady of the American stage, who never condescended to make a movie. He had done that. That was a major, major production. So, he was an important theatrical entity. And, but you think the money's going to go on forever. And Hollywood just collapsed or imploded in the late 40s. And everybody got pushed out the door. By the mid-50s, even Clark Gable had been given the walking papers. So, Basil Rathbone was, one of the first to go.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Clark Gable. I've read this recently. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but from what I understand, Basil Rathbone was Margaret Mitchell's first choice to play Red Butler in Gone with the Wind.
That's true, yeah. But Errol Flynn was a strong contender. And I recently found out that both Errol Flynn and Clark Gable collected 16mm prints of their movies, their work, and other feature films that they liked, and they would trade them. They would swap them. You want to borrow so and so? Okay, here. And then they, I don't know if they sent a driver over or what, but they got along quite well.
That's good to know. Now, as you mentioned earlier, this movie made us like a megastar out of Errol Flynn. And of course, we love it today as one of those essential classic films. But what was the reception like in 1938 with audiences?
Okay, that's an important thing. As I said, there were only so many theater seats, and they couldn't keep a film over a certain amount of time. The long run of the Robin Hood, and was it 16 weeks or something like that at the Egyptian, was because the theater had just opened. But for the most part, it was 2 or 3 weeks, and they just had to pull it because something else was waiting to come in. So what that meant was, if you went over a certain number of days filming for whatever reason, the star was ill, or something wasn't ready in time, or it just took too long for whatever reason, uh, that meant your movie was not going to make money. So this one, like The Wizard of Oz, The Rains Came, Marie Antoinette, Romeo and Juliet, The Good Earth, all these really important films that have become, textbook classics, the beloved films, uh, were all considered at the studio, ugh, we won't do that again, because they just didn't. They cost too much to make the profit that they needed. Um, this was like, it cost 2 million and made around 4, grossed around 4, which meant many people saw it, but it wasn't enough. So again, Wizard of Oz, this one, or the other films I mentioned, really were popular hits, had a big impact at the box office, but also in terms of prestige for the studio. But they didn't pay themselves back enough to justify their being made. Really, that's a sad thing.
Mm-hmm.
They would have to have made 6 to 8, maybe 9 million to justify that 2 million cost.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was overhead, there was advertising, there was all this other stuff that, all these hidden costs and stuff that really would just pull at a gross and diminish it.
Well, it
What a
makes
sad
you
thing.
right. Well, it makes you wonder back then. I mean, other than Gone with the Wind, what movies were making $9 million? I mean, especially like in the height of the Great Depression, it seems pretty. Seems like a tall order for anything.
I can tell you, King
Sure.
Kong,
Of course.
uh,
Okay.
the Tarzan. Tarzan made some money that I think the MGM most likely dummied the receipts, the books,
Mm-hmm.
so they wouldn't have to pay that much in taxes. But yeah, Tarzan, Andy Hardy, King Kong, Astaire Rogers. Um, uh, in the 40s, there was one film, Lady in the Dark with Ginger Rogers, which can't be shown now because of the rights problem, the music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, was a film that had sat on the shelf for a year and a half because of, in the World War II, the problem didn't happen in 38, but in World War II, they didn't have the overseas, so films were being delayed because Americans wanted to see a film over and over again. They were staying longer than 2 weeks, so films got stuck on a shelf. So anyways, Lady in the Dark came out with Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland, was an immense hit. And everything in 44, 45, 46 made a lot of money. Then came
Mm-hmm.
47, 48, oops, and TV, and the studios lost their theaters because of the Supreme Court ruling, and everything began to change. But in 38, they were still, there was no war yet in Europe. They were still, making money hand over fist.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of the films you mentioned, of course, like the Andy Hardy series, of course, the Tarzan sequels. I mean, I think it's safe to say they were certainly more B movies compared to something with a bigger budget like Robin Hood. So I imagine in
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
case, right.
This was a unique project, and
Mhm.
it really, and you have to give Hal Wallace credit for that, and for Casablanca, and for numerous other films, Captain Blood. I mean, Hal Wallace made Errol Flynn a star because he had a concept. Hal Wallace was a brilliant man, and that's what was so sad about Casablanca, when Jack Warner just refused to give him credit for having shepherded that to the great success it became.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's why Hal Wallace left Warner Brothers and went to Paramount, became an independent producer, making lots of really fantastic films. Sorry, Wrong Number, all the Tennessee Williams adaptations in the 50s. Made a star of Elvis Presley, by the way. So, what Hal Wallace did for Errol Flynn, he did for Elvis Presley, essentially.
Hmm. I'm trying to imagine Elvis Presley and the Adventures of Robin Hood. If they decided to remake it, that would have been quite an interesting film.
It's so sad that Elvis Presley was a good actor,
He was,
but
yeah.
that Colonel wouldn't let him do other kinds of films.
Hmm.
I believe Wallace wanted him to do other kinds of films.
And you can see it even if you watch something like Jailhouse Rock. He's a good performer. He's very natural. Obviously, had a lot of charisma. It is interesting to
Yeah, but
think,
he had a greater range than they allowed him.
right?
And this is what Errol Flynn was. Likewise, Errol Flynn was angry, constantly angry, with Jack Warner for not getting serious roles in something other than, he said, I was being forced to do all these swashbuckling roles when I had more in me that I could offer. And he said
Hmm.
they just saw me as a bit of color to splash on a scene. He said, as opposed to somebody with depth and range. And
Hmm.
that's why he went to MGM and did that Forsyth Woman with Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeon and Robert Young. And he played an unsympathetic character to show he could do it.
Hmm.
But the other problem was people didn't want to see him in those kind of roles. They wanted the swashbuckling.
Yeah. Well,
So what can you do?
right.
You've got a market. You have a market to please. You can't give them what they don't want.
And and that's the irony, even from doing or making a name for himself in this particular genre, whether it's him or Basil Rathbone or Claude Rains or whoever, we're still talking about these films, over half a century later.
Well, exactly. That's I often think it's so sad they couldn't film a stage play like with Catherine Cornell's Romeo and Juliet, or her Barrett's of Wimple Street,
Hmm.
or Lynn Fontanne and Alfred Lunt in The Taming of the Shrew. They couldn't make a filmed record of that play, or
Hmm.
even a recording of the voices, because it went into the ether and it's gone, and we'll never see them. Whereas we can watch these films. I mean, we are so lucky because film is more stable than digital, but it's not that stable. I
Hmm.
mean, I have films in my collection from 1941 that, thank God, they're sharp edge to edge. There's no warping. Uh, but there are many other films in my collection that are printed in the 50s or 60s that are going with from vinegar syndrome. They're warped and they don't stay in focus. And finally, they just cannot be projected again. So we're very lucky that as many films as have survived from the sound era. I mean, there's some that are lost. And of course, 80% of silent films are irretrievably lost. But we're lucky that we have these because it really is time travel.
Now, you mentioned that Errol Flynn was a bit of a party animal, and he loved burning the candle at both ends, shall we say. I've heard a story that Olivia de Havilland recounted in her later years. This must have been maybe 20 years. I mean, this was quite a bit of time had passed since making The Adventures of Robin Hood. She was at some kind of function in Beverly Hills, and she said this kind of frail old man came up to her and was very friendly with her. And of course, she was polite. She thought, okay, this has got some guy that came on in off the street, but he was very familiar with her. And he kind of looked at her and he's like, okay, hi. And she thought maybe she'd have to call security because this guy kept hanging around her. And later on, when they were sitting at the dinner, she realized that this man was Errol Flynn, her frequent co star. So, what was the fate of Errol Flynn?
He with the alcohol, but I didn't realize until recently when I saw the documentary, and his ex-wives and daughters said that he had used, I was it opium or morphine, some kind of thing like that.
Hmm.
Not cocaine exactly, although there was that too. Um, but the combination of all these substances and the lack of sleep, but also, you have to bear in mind, malaria, that's going to cut your life short.
Hmm.
Uh, it, it, so he died at 59, I believe. It was in 1959, I know that. No more saying. He was born on June 20th, 1909, and he died in 1959 in October.
So, he would have been 50.
50, that's it. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah. And the last 5 years, he just was kind of a walking wreck. Very sad.
It reminds me a lot of another actor who you could compare in many ways to Errol Flynn in terms of the type of roles he played and his lifestyle. I think of Tyrone Power, who did such a wonderful job in The Mark of Zorro. Again, another film, another remake of a Douglas Fairbanks silent film. But I understand he had a lot of heart problems and health issues, and he passed away. What was he like, 45? Relatively young
40,
age.
44.
44 of a heart attack. And you look
Yeah, and in that case, he was not a dissipated person. But see, in those days, also people didn't know how dangerous cigarettes and nicotine, in particular, and alcohol and meat, eating all those rich meats and sauces and things. They didn't realize that what it could do. But his father died of a heart attack, and he wasn't that old. So, but he wasn't dissipated. I mean, Tyrone Power. Now, in John Barrymore, that was the role model for Errol Flynn, and it was very much the same thing. That they had their demons, and in both cases, it was from the parents mistreating a child. Those things happen.
Now, I heard a story. I don't know if this is from Kenneth Anger, or Hollywood Babylon, or what have you, but I heard a story that when John Barrymore passed away, Errol Flynn kidnapped his corpse from the funeral home and took him on a joyride. Is that true?
No, the story that was in that book was that they had some friends of Barrymore's went to the mortuary and took the body and put it in Errol Flynn's living room.
Oh, okay.
Sitting in a chair. Well, it didn't happen because Gene Fowler and Will Fowler, his son, sat in the mortuary with the body all night. So that never happened. And Errol Flynn put that in his book and then later tried to have it taken out, but it was too late. It had gone to press. Although the book really was published posthumously. But yeah, he did express regret for having said that.
Yeah.
And now John Barrymore's granddaughter, Drew Barrymore, believes it's true, and it certainly was not true. Never happened.
Right.
It's not true. If you like this film, I'd recommend The Adventures of Don Juan, which is 10 years later. You won't see the same Errol Flynn exactly, but it is an excellent film, and he is in good form given his already noticeable decline. Captain Blood is excellent. It's a wonderful film, and it's in black and white, but it's very beautiful black and white. Hal Moore photographed it. And Errol Flynn's favorite movie was Gentleman Jim, which is a boxing movie, and about friendship and about idol worship and everything. A lot of great themes.
He made a lot of classic films, but where do you rank Adventures of Robin Hood amongst those amazing classic films?
Well, it's up there with Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind in terms of, a textbook classic, a film that, or Casablanca. It's really an important film because it works on so many different levels.
All right, Mark, is there anything else you're working on right now or anything that's just come out that you want the audience to know about?
I'm trying to prepare for your next interview, which I think is going to be about Faster Pussycat Kill Kill.
Of course, exactly, yeah. So, no, but yes, I'm definitely looking forward to that. Well, Mr. Mark A. Vieira, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed tonight's film as much as we did. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.